Thank you. Now we're going to go to one of our union leaders. We've got Greg Floyd.
Teamsters,
All
yes.
right. A lot of our South Bend folks are Teamsters. So.
Thank you. We represent the largest housing authority in the world, New York City Public Housing Authority. There are 500,000 people living there. Housing, public housing in our nation is suffering. Do you have a plan for rescuing our public housing system that's desperately needed by minorities and poor people?
I do, and this is another one I've seen firsthand because we have a public housing authority in South Bend that's had some major struggles. And I've gone from really pressuring the folks in charge to still pressuring them, but understanding better the constraints that they're under, as long as our federal housing policy is the way it is. Part of it's just numbers. We do not have enough investment to make it possible to have these wait lists make any sense, or even to fund the kind of inspections that would make it possible, whether we're talking about Section 8 or whether we're talking about actual building projects. I also believe, when it comes to housing, that, and this is part of the Douglas Plan with what we call a Community Homestead Act, that we can make investments that help families build up equity while also retaining historic residents in the neighborhoods that they lived in, that have been historically redlined, and give them the ability through a forgivable lien to capture the whole value of the improvements to a home that they take on board through this plan. This is another area where we have to be mindful of how we got here and recognize we're not talking about quaint, far-off historic wrongs from centuries ago. We're talking about stuff that, if either in my lifetime or certainly in my parents' lifetime, excluded a lot of people. And so whether it's the conditions for those who are in public housing right now, which I think is not just a question of funding, but is largely a question of funding, to the ability to make sure more and more people can succeed or survive with more affordable housing generally that doesn't have them as reliant on the federal housing system. Until we get that done, we are going to continue to struggle in communities of any size.
So, Mayor Pete, my name is Tamika Mallory. I was one of the 4 co-founders of the Women's March and co-chair of the Women's March on Washington. And I think, sort of piggybacking on what Mr. Williams said, I find it's very troubling to me that the mayor of the city we're in right now, and also you as a mayor, are having such a hard time, in my opinion, being able to clearly state why people have not been fired, police officers who have harmed individuals. I know that there's, a lot about process and all of that, but we know, based upon the law, that you as a mayor have the ability to fire or at least influence firing of a particular police officer who has violated the civil rights of any person. So that's one piece. And I think it's important for you to understand, just like Mayor de Blasio here, it matters to us what the people of your local community feel about you. And I know for me as an organizer, there is no way that I can support you outside of what is being stated in your internal community. So those issues, the perception and what was raised here, is really important to us that we get down to an answer that is clear, quick, and concise on why these officers have not been fired. Now, the other piece in terms of what is being asked about strategy is that while I think President Trump is clearly a bully, but there's also the issue of cheating when we talk about elections. And so the question that I have for you is, in your strategy, how are you going to deal with voter suppression? Because that is a very, very significant issue for people of color, and particularly in the South. And I think it's something that we need to all be thinking about and want to know what your leadership is going to be on that particular issue.
Yeah. Thanks for that. First, just briefly on the first piece, I do hope that people follow very closely what's happening in South Bend. So, for example, the officer in the most recent incident is gone. He resigned. And just to be clear, now suppose he hadn't resigned. And suppose, because it would be politically smart, I had said something about how he ought to be fired before the hearing happened. What would likely happen then was there would be a hearing, he would be fired, he would sue us for reinstatement, and he would win. So it's just one of those moments where the smart thing to do politically is not the right thing to do for the community. And I can't speak to any of what's going on in New York. I don't know your situation here enough. But all I ask is that what I say and what I do be evaluated mostly in terms of whether it's the right thing to do. And we can hash that out and talk about it and debate it. But I hope there is no confusion about my expectation that any officer with any racist tendencies needs to find a different line of work immediately. Now, in terms of strategy, there's two ways to think about this. And the first and the more important probably is what I think you're talking about, which is that we cannot call ourselves a democracy when people are being excluded, usually in racially motivated ways, by a party that's figured out that if everybody votes, they won't win. And when the Supreme Court says, well, it's fine to manipulate the districts for partisan reasons, you just can't use race. Well, how do we think they're going to figure out their partisan reasons? They'll just call it by a different name, right? We know this is happening. Unfortunately, my state's one of the ones that pioneered this. Indiana did the voter ID law, went all the way to the Supreme Court. When you go to vote in South Bend, there is a poster on the wall of the polling place with a big stop sign. It says stop. And then it tells you all the terrible things that will happen if you vote in a way that isn't honest. So, look, policy-wise, we need a new Voting Rights Act. Amen. That will ensure that this kind of voter suppression cannot happen. We've got to do it. That's not much use to us in 2020, right? We got to enact it, but until. So the only thing I can say about 2020 is let's not let it be close. Like a president like this guy should not be within cheating distance of winning. The cheating happened, and it may have made all the difference, but it shouldn't even be close. And that's the part as a candidate I can work on. As an official, then I can work on the other part.
Well, thank you so much for joining us
Thank
here
you.
today.
Pleasure.